Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing game 27 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Minnesota Wild, in which the Sharks have lost 5-2. Now, that score might not look particularly attractive if you're a San Jose Sharks fan, but just know that this game actually ended up being a lot closer than the scoreboard would suggest, as the Wild would end up getting 2 empty net goals at the end of this one to kind of pad the stats a bit. But the Sharks actually played a relatively close game to the Wild, though not in a very normal way. In fact, through the first 40 minutes of this game, it was pretty clear that the Minnesota Wild were indeed the better team. In the first period, they started off with the first goal of the game. That one came from Kevin Fiala, and for the first 15 minutes of that first period, it was pretty much all Wild. The Sharks would maybe get 2 or 3 chances in that first 15 minutes, and those were kind of one and done chances. Meanwhile, the Wild would have all the zone time, all of the possession. It was pretty much just domination by Minnesota. However, in the last few minutes of the first period, the Sharks would actually fight back, get some chances for themselves, but Cam Talbot would stand tall, and so it would be 1-0 Minnesota at the end of the first period. At the start of the second period, the Sharks would continue the type of play that they had near the end of the first period, and for the first 6 or 7 minutes of that middle frame, the Sharks were still managing to get some chances, get some shots off, but then they'd end up taking a penalty, which would put the Minnesota Wild on a power play where Eriksson Ek would score to get a 2-0 lead for the Minnesota Wild, and then things turned back into the Wild's favor. They continued to pressure for the rest of the second period, would add yet another goal from Jordan Greenway on another power play, and so it would be a 3-0 Minnesota Wild score at the end of the second period. Now, you might normally kind of just turn off the game at that point. The Sharks are trailing by 3 goals, but, obviously the previous night against the Flames, the Sharks trailed by 2 and still managed to end up coming back to win that one in regulation. So for those who held out hope for a possible comeback, you were almost rewarded in this one. The Sharks actually looked significantly better than the Wild in the third period. They looked like the team that was at the top of the division, and the Wild looked like the team that were fighting for a wild card spot, because the Sharks were just skating circles around anything that the Minnesota Wild could do. I don't think the Wild had even maybe one good chance they had in that third period, if that. Meanwhile, the Sharks were just firing opportunity after opportunity and would get 1 goal from Jonathan Dahlen to make it 3-1, and then another from Tomas Hertl on a power play to make it 3-2. And like I said, the Sharks brought it into those last couple of minutes, but they end up pulling the goaltender. They don't even get really a good chance away with the goaltender pulled. The Sharks just poor puck management in those very brief moments with Aiden Hill out of the net. The Wild make them pay Jordan Greenway. Pretty nice Juan race, as he's the one who has to skate in the straight line. Burns has to angle across, so a bit more difficult, as of course that is a longer path to take. So Greenway is able to outmuscle Burns in the end to get the empty net, and eventually it is a Barabanov misplay as the puck jumps over his stick that leads to the Kaprizov empty netter, and as such the Wild won it 5-2. But like I said, ended up being a bit of a closer game. If you take in general the parts where the Sharks actually looked better than the Wild, you'd get about 30 to 32 minutes, and that's half the game. And when you're going against one of the best teams in the NHL, the Minnesota Wild, who we came into this game on a 7-game winning streak and now have an 8-game winning streak, that's actually not that bad of a performance. You may be thinking, well, the Sharks probably should have been able to show up like they did in the third period prior to falling behind 3-0, and you would be right. And obviously some of those things have to be attributed to the Wild maybe taking their foot off the gas a bit, but in the end, still a nice performance, and it does inspire confidence moving forward for the Sharks. Moving on to the lineup here on the first line, at least this was the first line for a decent chunk of the game. Meyer, Couture, and Dahlen was once again the Sharks' best line here of the night, but in particular the 2 wingers really stood out in a very positive light. Jonathan Dahlen in particular felt like he was potentially the Sharks' best player of the game, was getting so many fantastic chances. It just felt as though a goal was absolutely coming. Even in the first couple of periods when the Sharks were at times struggling, Jonathan Dahlen was really one of the only forwards who was actually generating any real scoring chances. Him and of course Timo Meier and Logan Couture, his line mates. But Jonathan Dahlen in particular really seemed like he was going to be able to get a goal, and eventually he was rewarded indeed. A tip shot shot or a tip on a Erik Carlson shot would get him his 8th goal of the season. Timo Meier as well, also a very effective game for himself. But the odd man out a bit on this line actually ended up being Logan Couture, right? I said Dahlin was absolutely fantastic, best player there. Meier also very, very strong right behind Dahlin. Logan Couture, while not bad, didn't necessarily have the same chances and output, I would say, as Dahlin and Meier, and maybe Bob Booner was a bit understanding of that because it was another swap that we saw like back a couple of games ago against the Blue Jackets, where Couture was actually moved to the second line and swapped with Tomas Hertl, and the new put together first line of Hertl, Meier, and Dahlin ended up somehow even looking better than the Couture, Meier, Dahlin line in that third period. Hertl just added an amazing element to that first line. This was the first time I really saw Hertl getting some dominant shifts in a long time. He also ends up getting a goal, though, of course, on the power play, not at even strength with this line, but still. The Hertl, Meier, Dahlin line, it was super impressive in that third period, and as such, while after the Columbus game, I was definitely not surprised to see Couture, Dahlin, and Meier remain together as a line moving into the following one. But after the performance here tonight against the Wild, honestly, I feel as though this Meier, Dahlin, and now Hertl line should be staying together. When it comes to the second line, this one underwent a few more changes. It wasn't just Couture joining Gregor and Barabanov, though it was the case at first. In the end, we actually had Barabanov moving down to the fourth line in place of Kevin Labanc, who was put back into the lineup here tonight. Obviously, he was a healthy scratch in the previous game against the Calgary Flames, and it seems as though Labanc has responded really well to that benching. In the first couple of periods, he had a couple of good shifts. I wouldn't say he was blowing anybody away, but he's certainly decent and better than he had looked in previous games. And certainly he ended up doing enough to get moved up to the second line, but once he ended up on that second line with Couture and Gregor, he actually looked significantly better than he has as of late, was getting some pretty good chances, also looked like a player who could, potentially get a goal in that game, though that didn't end up happening. And I felt as though while, a player like Gregor and Barabanov struggled early on in this game, when Labanc was put with those two, things definitely ended up picking up. So we might actually, with the loss here tonight against the Minnesota Wild, be seeing some pretty new lines, when in the past few games it's been pretty constant, at least in the top six for the Sharks. Besides the injury to Balcers, we've seen Meier, Couture, and Dahlin together for pretty much the entire season, if these three players were healthy, and then Hertl, Barabanov, and then Balcers going down, and so Gregor or Labanc or someone like that. So we might actually be getting some movement here in the lineup. Honestly, I wouldn't even be surprised to see a player like Barabanov get the Kevin Labanc treatment from last game and potentially get the healthy scratch. I don't think it would happen. I suspect he'll just be moved down to the fourth line and be given an opportunity to try and work his way back up into the lineup, maybe over a player like Gregor if he underperforms, maybe over a player like Kevin Labanc if he sort of reverts back to where he was just a few days ago. But Barabanov, not that great of a game here tonight. On the third line, Nieto, Bonino, and Cogliano, definitely not as good as they have been in the past few games, but still certainly not bad. Didn't play a terrible game. They had a couple of decent offensive zone shifts. In particular, I thought the player who stood out the most on this line was actually Matt Nieto, which I guess is a bit of a surprise because for me, this line has really been the Bonino and Cogliano show, and then Nieto kind of just sort of tagged along a bit. But here tonight, definitely Nieto did impress me somewhat. It wasn't super crazy. Obviously, this line didn't score any goals or anything of that sort, but still has been keeping it up as a productive third line for the Sharks. And then when it comes to the fourth line, obviously, like I said, they had a couple of decent shifts early on in this game, which was enough to get Labanc promoted up to that second line by come third period. Once Weatherby, Gadjevich were put with Barabanov in the third period, nothing much really happened. I wouldn't say any of these players particularly blew me away or anything, and that's basically been on theme for the Sharks' fourth line for the vast majority of this season thus far, so nothing really more to say about that. When it comes onto the defensive side of things, the first player I do want to talk about has to be Jacob Middleton for the very interesting game that he ended up having, as he ended up taking 3 penalties for the Sharks, who only had 3 penalties in this entire game. And this wasn't just, he took a double minor or something like that, or a major penalty. No, he took 3 distinct and separate 2-minute minor penalties. So that was kind of a rare sight to see. I do not remember the last time we've seen any Sharks player, if not just any player in general, get 3 different minor penalties in one particular game, and for those to be the only 3 penalties his entire team took in the game. But definitely an interesting situation for Middleton. You can tell after getting called with those 3 penalties, he was much more sort of nervous, I guess you could say, on the defensive side of things, maybe not playing his game as hard. Hopefully that doesn't necessarily affect him as we move on into the following games during this year. This was probably just pretty much a one-off, but it is definitely an interesting observation. When it comes to Erik Carlson, there was this obvious misplay when it came on this first Wild empty net goal. The Sharks were trying to just keep this puck alive and get things settled in the zone to try and get a chance on the 6-on-5 to be able to tie this game. Carlson at first made a very clean pass at the blue line to keep the puck alive, moved it over. I believe it was to Timo Meier, if I'm not mistaken. But then a second time, Carlson tried to do yet another very cutesy type of play. He ended up getting punished, and that would lead to the Jordan Greenway goal. But otherwise, I thought Erik Carlson was once again extremely effective on the offensive side of things here tonight. I don't think he was necessarily terrible defensively either, so it continues to be very nice to see Erik Carlson really have a pretty solid resurgence this season. I don't feel as though Erik Carlson has really looked this good as consistently as he has been since probably the 18-19 season, the first year that the Sharks actually had Carlson, prior to when he actually got injured that season and was just looking very, very good. Carlson has been playing at a very, very high level at this point. Another couple of players who I do want to mention has to be Milosh and Vlasic. This was a pairing that I have been criticizing, well, at least the Vlasic third pairing I've been criticizing over the past few games, and just in the previous one against the Calgary Flames, I said that Milosh didn't look particularly good in my eyes, neither did Vlasic, and it wouldn't surprise me to see Milosh either get subbed back out for Vadim Shemek, or a player potentially could come up from the Barracuda, but instead, Milosh gets another game here. He plays in front of Vadim Shemek, and it seems as though that ended up being the correct decision for Bob Booner, because Milosh looked significantly better here tonight. Definitely not as many defensive errors. Very, very calm game. I wouldn't say he's really doing much on the offensive side of things, though there was this one play, I believe, that did occur where he actually had a pretty decent move in the offensive zone to keep the puck alive. But otherwise, it was a very calm, very low event game for this third pairing, and that's pretty much what you want to see from a pairing that features 2 players that haven't really shown any offensive talents, at least in terms for Vlasic in the past few years, and for Milosh in his really entire short NHL career. When it comes to the goaltending, Aiden Hill had a pretty interesting game, so I could definitely contrast it to the previous game against the Calgary Flames. He let in 3 goals, and in that one I had said that the first couple were not his fault, but the third goal that he did give up was one that he probably could have had. However, I was more forgiving of it because Aiden Hill came up with a ton of other big saves in that game, and of course the Sharks ended up winning. But that's not necessarily the case here tonight. You see, when it comes to Aiden Hill's first 2 goals here tonight as well, not really his fault. Couldn't do much on the Fiala one, couldn't do much on the Eriksson Ek one, but when it comes to this Jordan Greenway goal, this was one that Aiden Hill definitely could have had, and unfortunately for Hill, that goal ended up being the game winner. So in the end, he kind of gets outdueled by Cam Talbot. I wouldn't say that this was all in all an awful game for Aiden Hill. I definitely wouldn't put this game entirely on him, but it's another game where Aiden Hill comes in, he gives up a pretty bad goal like he has been doing over his past few starts, and this time it kind of ended up burning the Sharks. So that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they will take on Joe Pavelski and the Dallas Stars. The Sharks did not see the Dallas Stars, of course, last season because of the limited divisional format, so the Sharks haven't seen Pavelski in a while, but they'll be playing against the Stars for the first time this season, and the Stars, just like the Minnesota Wild have been looking a lot better as of late, so we'll see if the Sharks can handle them. Class dismissed.